Not every love that feels intense is healthy. Sometimes intensity is the shadow seeking completion. Intensity often masquerades as depth, arriving with urgency, obsession, and emotional fireworks that feel like destiny. The nervous system interprets heightened arousal as significance, so the heart assumes that what shakes it must be meaningful. Yet what stirs you most strongly is not always what serves you most wisely. Intensity can be the body's memory waking up, calling you back into unfinished stories, unhealed attachments, and familiar patterns that once defined survival. The pull feels ancient because it is rooted in repetition, not revelation. When the shadow seeks completion, it looks for mirrors. It gravitates toward people who resemble unresolved figures from the past, dynamics that echo old wounds, and situations that promise a different ending to the same emotional script. The psyche tries to finish what was never integrated, hoping that this time the story will resolve in safety, validation, or rescue. The magnetism is not about the other person's essence. It is about the unfinished business within you. The connection feels fated because the wound recognizes itself in disguise. Intensity accelerates bonding before discernment has time to speak. The rush collapses boundaries, blurs red flags, and reframes instability as passion. Emotional volatility becomes proof of depth. Jealousy is mistaken for devotion. Unpredictability is renamed mystery. What feels like aliveness is often the nervous system toggling between hope and threat, a pattern learned in environments where love was inconsistent or conditional. The body confuses adrenaline with intimacy, and the heart calls the familiar chaos chemistry. Healthy love tends to feel quieter at first. It does not hijack attention or demand urgency. It invites steadiness, presence, and a gradual unfolding of trust. To an unhealed inner world, this can feel underwhelming or even suspicious. Calm may be interpreted as boredom because the psyche has been trained to equate love with emotional spikes. When peace feels foreign, the shadow reaches for what feels charged, not because it is nourishing, but because it is recognizable. The shadow's hunger for completion can also manifest as savior fantasies. One may feel compelled to heal, fix, or redeem another, mistaking caretaking for connection. This dynamic grants a temporary sense of purpose and importance, soothing old fears of being unseen. Yet it entangles worth with usefulness, creating bonds that thrive on imbalance. The intensity comes from the illusion of being indispensable, not from mutual wholeness. Over time, resentment grows as the role of rescuer drains vitality and eclipses reciprocity. Intensity thrives on projection. The early phase of attachment invites you to project unlived qualities onto the other: strength, freedom, depth, safety. The beloved becomes a screen for parts of yourself that long to emerge. The emotional charge is the psyche's recognition of its own potential, mistakenly located outside. As reality intrudes, the projections collapse, and the intensity often flips into disappointment or conflict. What felt transcendent becomes demanding, because the relationship was carrying the weight of inner work that belonged to you. Completion does not come from repeating the pattern with a new face. It comes from integrating the pattern within. Integration requires slowing down enough to notice what is being activated: the fear of abandonment, the craving for validation, the reflex to earn love through performance. It asks for boundaries that protect your nervous system, discernment that honors your values, and honesty about what feels familiar versus what feels healthy. When the shadow is welcomed into awareness, its compulsions loosen their grip. As the inner world becomes more integrated, attraction shifts. What once felt thrilling may begin to feel draining, while steadiness begins to feel supportive. This is not a loss of passion, but a reorientation of desire toward what sustains rather than destabilizes. The heart learns to recognize safety as intimacy, presence as depth, and consistency as devotion. The longing for completion moves inward, where the work of wholeness gradually reshapes what love feels like. You attract what mirrors your unhealed patterns, not what matches your highest self. Attraction is not random. It is patterned by memory, conditioning, and the emotional templates formed in early relationships. The psyche learns what love feels like before it learns what love should be, and that early imprint quietly organizes later desire. What feels familiar often feels safe, even when it is not kind, because familiarity reduces uncertainty. The heart reaches toward what it recognizes, not necessarily toward what will help it grow. Unhealed patterns operate beneath conscious choice. They shape the tone of connection you gravitate toward, the emotional roles you slip into, and the stories you tell yourself about what you deserve. If love once came with inconsistency, you may be drawn to unpredictability and call it excitement. If affection was conditional, you may pursue distance and call it challenge. These dynamics replay because the inner world is seeking resolution, hoping that this time the story will end differently. The repetition is an attempt at mastery over old pain, even when it recreates the same hurt. The highest self is quieter than the wound. It does not shout through urgency or obsession. It speaks through alignment, values, and a sense of coherence that unfolds over time. When you are oriented toward your highest self, attraction becomes less about intensity and more about integrity. You begin to notice how you feel in someone's presence after the excitement settles, whether your nervous system softens or tightens, whether your boundaries feel respected or negotiated away, whether your voice grows clearer or smaller. These signals guide you toward what nourishes rather than what merely stimulates. Projection bridges unhealed patterns and attraction. You project unmet needs onto others, turning them into symbols of what you wish to receive: safety, affirmation, belonging. The emotional charge comes from encountering your own unlived qualities in another. This is why early connections can feel transcendent. You are glimpsing parts of yourself that want expression. When those projections dissolve, the relationship is asked to stand on reality. If reality does not support mutual growth, the bond strains under expectations it was never meant to carry. Self-betrayal often accompanies pattern-based attraction. You override intuition to preserve connection, rationalize misalignment to avoid loss, and negotiate your values to keep intensity alive. Each small compromise teaches the nervous system that love requires self-abandonment. Over time, the highest self feels distant because it has not been consulted. Healing reorients loyalty back to the inner compass, making choices that honor well-being even when they disrupt familiar attachments. Patterns persist until they are made conscious. Awareness interrupts automaticity. Naming what you are drawn to, how it mirrors the past, and what it costs you in the present weakens the spell of inevitability. This is not about blame, but about responsibility for your inner landscape. As you cultivate emotional literacy, you learn to pause before attachment solidifies, to differentiate longing from compatibility, and to choose relationships that support regulation rather than dysregulation. When healing advances, attraction recalibrates. You become less captivated by potential and more responsive to presence. You value consistency over charisma, transparency over mystery, reciprocity over pursuit. This shift can feel anticlimactic at first because the nervous system is no longer riding emotional peaks. Yet what replaces the rush is a steadier warmth, a sense of being met rather than managed by the relationship. Desire aligns with dignity, and connection becomes a place where your higher qualities are welcomed into daily life. Choosing in alignment with the highest self does not eliminate complexity, but it reduces unnecessary suffering. You still encounter differences, conflicts, and growth edges, yet the relationship becomes a container for becoming rather than a stage for replaying old scripts. As unhealed patterns integrate, attraction becomes less about completing the past and more about participating in a present that reflects who you are choosing to become. The heart recognizes truth faster than the mind accepts it. There is an immediate knowing that arrives before language, before evidence, before reasons line up into neat explanations. This knowing lives in sensation, in the subtle shifts of the nervous system, in the quiet tightening or softening that happens when you encounter a person, a choice, or a path. The body registers coherence and incongruence long before the intellect constructs a narrative to justify or dismiss what is felt. This is why you can sense when something is off, even while your thoughts assemble arguments to keep things comfortable. The mind is a skilled negotiator. It protects identity, attachments, and the stories that preserve continuity. When truth threatens to disrupt belonging, security, or self-image, the mind delays acceptance through doubt, rationalization, and selective attention. It looks for exceptions, minimizes discomfort, and reframes warning signals as temporary glitches. This resistance is not malice. It is the mind's effort to maintain stability in the face of change. Yet stability built on denial is fragile, and the cost of ignoring early signals accumulates in the form of confusion, fatigue, and a dull sense of inner conflict. Emotional truth often arrives as unease rather than clarity. It can be felt as a quiet heaviness after certain conversations, a subtle contraction around certain commitments, or a persistent pull away from what once felt right. Because these signals are ambiguous, the mind prefers certainty and delays action until proof feels sufficient. But proof is rarely available in the moments when direction matters most. Waiting for absolute certainty becomes a way to avoid the vulnerability of choosing in the presence of incomplete information. The gap between recognition and acceptance widens when attachment is strong. Love, loyalty, and hope can soften the edges of reality, making it harder to acknowledge what contradicts desire. You may sense misalignment in values, boundaries, or availability, yet the mind frames these as fixable or temporary because the heart is invested. The longer the investment, the more persuasive the rationalizations become. This creates an inner split. One part of you knows, while another part negotiates against that knowing. Cultivating discernment requires learning to listen to the body without immediately converting sensation into story. This means pausing to notice patterns rather than isolated moments, tracking how you feel over time in specific contexts, and distinguishing excitement from steadiness. It means honoring discomfort as information rather than as an inconvenience to be managed away. When the heart's signals are welcomed into awareness, the mind can become an ally instead of a gatekeeper, translating felt truth into wise action. The heart's recognition is not impulsive emotion. It is an integrated sensing that includes memory, intuition, and lived experience. It registers coherence with values, safety with boundaries, and resonance with authenticity. The mind's role is to evaluate, contextualize, and plan, not to override the initial signal when it is inconvenient. When these faculties collaborate, decisions align with both truth and practicality. When they compete, the result is paralysis or repeated self-betrayal. Learning to trust early recognition does not mean acting without reflection. It means taking inner signals seriously enough to investigate them with curiosity rather than suppressing them with logic. Questions like, what am I feeling here, what pattern is emerging, and what is being protected by delaying acceptance invite clarity. Over time, honoring these signals strengthens self-trust. The inner dialogue becomes less adversarial and more coherent, allowing choices to reflect what is known rather than what is feared. As acceptance catches up to recognition, the sense of inner friction eases. Decisions feel cleaner, boundaries feel less negotiable, and relationships become more congruent with values. The nervous system experiences relief when action aligns with truth, even if the path forward carries uncertainty. This alignment fosters resilience because it is rooted in integrity rather than convenience. When the heart is listened to and the mind is enlisted to support its wisdom, life organizes around what is real rather than what is merely tolerable. Secrets grow in the dark where fear replaces honesty. What is hidden does not remain neutral. It acquires weight, momentum, and influence precisely because it is concealed. Silence becomes a fertile ground where assumptions multiply and narratives harden without the tempering effect of truth. Fear keeps the door closed not only to others but to the self, as unspoken realities drift into the background of awareness and begin to shape behavior from behind the scenes. Fear replaces honesty when the perceived cost of truth feels greater than the cost of concealment. The fear may be of rejection, conflict, loss of status, or the collapse of a carefully maintained identity. In relationships, this fear convinces people that withholding is protective, that omission is kindness, that timing will someday become perfect, yet postponement rarely dissolves what needs to be spoken. It compounds it. The longer truth is deferred, the more fragile the structure built around the secret becomes, and the more energy is required to maintain the illusion of coherence. Darkness is not merely the absence of light, it is the absence of shared reality. When truth is withheld, connection thins. Others sense the incongruence even if they cannot name it, and trust erodes through subtle cues, evasive language, guarded affect, inconsistent behavior. The nervous system is sensitive to mismatch. It registers when words and energy diverge, and this discrepancy breeds unease. What might have been a difficult but clarifying conversation becomes a slow leak in the fabric of intimacy. Secrets do not stay contained within their original context. They leak into tone, posture, timing, and choice. The effort to hide reorganizes priorities and narrows the range of authenticity available in interaction. This constriction limits spontaneity and deepens self-surveillance, as the mind tracks what must not be revealed. Over time, the inner world becomes crowded with split-off truths, and the outer world reflects this fragmentation through guarded relationships and performative stability. Fear-driven secrecy often masquerades as self-protection, but it tends to protect the wound rather than the person. It shields the vulnerable parts from exposure while also depriving them of the conditions needed for repair, understanding, accountability, and empathy. When honesty is delayed, opportunities for mutual growth are missed. The other person is denied the chance to respond with care or clarity, and the self is denied the relief that comes from being seen in complexity rather than curated fragments. The cost of secrecy is paid in attention. Energy that could nourish creativity, presence, and connection is diverted into managing appearances. This management becomes habitual, and the body learns to hold tension around what cannot be said. Over time, this tension can manifest as fatigue, irritability, or a dull sense of disconnection from one's own inner life. The price of concealment is not just relational distance, it is the erosion of inner congruence. Honesty, when offered with care, brings light not as exposure for its own sake, but as restoration of shared reality. Light allows nuance, repair, and recalibration. It invites accountability without annihilation and vulnerability without surrendering dignity. Honesty does not guarantee acceptance, but it clarifies the terms of connection. It allows relationships to be based on what is true rather than what is maintained. Even when outcomes are uncertain, alignment with truth reduces the inner burden of fragmentation. Choosing honesty over fear is a practice, not a single act. It involves discerning timing, tone, and intention, and committing to transparency that respects both self and other. It asks for courage to tolerate discomfort and humility to accept imperfect responses. As light returns to what was hidden, the psychic energy bound in secrecy becomes available for growth. The inner world regains coherence, and relationships gain the possibility of depth grounded in shared reality rather than managed appearance. Real love reveals who you are. False love feeds who you are trying to escape. Real love has a way of bringing your true contours into view, not by flattering an image, but by inviting your authentic shape to emerge. In its presence, you do not have to contort to be chosen. Your voice becomes steadier, your boundaries clearer, your values easier to articulate. The relationship functions like a mirror, polished by care, reflecting you back to yourself with honesty and warmth. You feel more like yourself, not because you are affirmed in every impulse, but because your essential qualities are welcomed into the space between you. False love, by contrast, often rewards the performance that once kept you safe. It gravitates toward the roles you learned to play when authenticity felt risky: the pleaser, the fixer, the self-sacrificer, the stoic. In these dynamics, Love is conditional upon maintaining the familiar mask. You are valued for how well you soothe, adapt, or disappear, not for who you are when you stand in your own center. The bond feels compelling because it confirms an old identity that promised survival, even as it quietly undermines growth. Real love supports differentiation. It does not collapse individuality into fusion, nor does it demand distance as proof of independence. It tolerates difference without framing it as threat. In this safety, you discover preferences you had muted, desires you had postponed, and limits you had blurred. You become more transparent with yourself because transparency does not jeopardize connection. Conflict becomes a site of learning rather than a referendum on belonging, and repair becomes a shared language rather than a power struggle. False love thrives on reenactment. It replays the emotional climates of the past, reproducing familiar highs and lows that feel strangely meaningful. The nervous system confuses this familiarity with intimacy, mistaking volatility for depth. Attention is won through crisis, affection is rationed, and uncertainty keeps the bond alive. In these patterns, growth threatens the relationship because growth disrupts the roles that sustain the dynamic. As you move toward your authentic center, the old choreography loses its grip, and the connection resists the change. Real love is spacious. It creates room for becoming. It does not require you to remain consistent with who you were when the bond began. It welcomes your evolution even when that evolution introduces complexity. You are allowed to revise your story, refine your values, and renegotiate your needs. This spaciousness does not dilute commitment. It deepens it by rooting commitment in presence rather than possession. The relationship becomes a living field where both people are invited to be more fully themselves. False love is constrictive. It narrows possibility by tethering affection to predictability. You learn to monitor yourself, editing thoughts and feelings to maintain harmony. The cost of authenticity rises, and self-expression becomes strategic rather than spontaneous. Over time, this self-monitoring erodes vitality. The inner world grows quieter, not from peace but from suppression. The relationship feeds the parts of you that learn to survive by adapting, while the parts of you that long to thrive wait at the margins. Real love is attuned to your well-being. It does not celebrate your exhaustion as devotion or your silence as maturity. It notices when you withdraw from yourself and invites your return. Care is expressed through curiosity, responsiveness, and respect for limits. In this care, you experience a gentler form of strength, the capacity to be seen without armor, to be challenged without being diminished, to be held without being owned. False love confuses intensity with intimacy. It amplifies longing by keeping fulfillment just out of reach. The emotional economy runs on scarcity, and the chase becomes the glue. Validation arrives unpredictably, reinforcing attachment through intermittent reward. This dynamic feeds the self that learned to equate effort with worth, convincing you that love must be earned through endurance. The more you grow into your authentic self, the less compatible this economy becomes, revealing the misalignment that intensity once concealed.